This airlayer has failed. This airlayer has failed. This airlayer has failed. It is the middle of summer and you might think this airlayer has failed. Everybody told you 6 to 8 weeks after you put the airlayer in place, you will have roots. You peeked in the pot and there were no roots. So you take the layer off and you decide, I can toss this away. It has failed. Now, how do you know when an airlayer has failed? And if you are concerned that it is failing, what do you do? In this video, the most important thing to realize is that an airlayer has only failed when the part that you want to layer off has died. Until then, all you have to do is have more patience. It is now July, and for me, all the airlayers that I put in April or early May will be checked to see whether there's roots. And this year, I think I have 0 airlayers with root. We've had a very cold and wet spring. It has been raining almost constantly. Only 1 or 2 weeks we had nice weather, and therefore I think they've just been kept too wet. Besides that, as you can tell now, it is very windy, which is not very good for pots that are awkwardly attached. Now this one is attached pretty well, but I've seen it has sunk down a little bit. So I'm going to open it up and check for roots. If there are roots, I might break them, and it might take a long time for new roots to form. However, I have the feeling that this has sunk down, so I think there's no roots. Be very gentle opening it up so that you don't twist the container, because if there are roots, you don't want to break them. Well, can you believe it? I was wrong. There are roots. Now this is an interesting layer because I removed the bark here and I removed the bark here. I wanted this to become a twin trunk bonsai and this to become a separate bonsai. Now it hasn't formed roots here at the base, just at this side branch, and this hasn't rooted because indeed the pot had slipped down and therefore this wound wasn't fully covered. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to clip it off, plant it up very deep so that these roots on the one hand can provide for the rest of the plant, and this top still has a chance to start growing. We'll see how this goes. And now to avoid it from shaking and moving in the wind, I'm going to put this in the shed, water it well, and then it stays there for a week or 2 for the roots to establish, making sure that the substrate never fully dries out. And a nice clean cut here. Now, as we are talking about failed airlayers, what is it that makes an airlayer fail? Well, one thing that is important is the branch that you use needs to be thick enough. The moment you remove the bark, the branch becomes a lot thinner and it might break off, but also the wood inside can dry out. So therefore, make sure your branch is thick enough. I think about 1/2 inch, maybe 1 centimeter. That is the minimum that normally people that are starting with airlayers should start off with. Next to that, it is really important to use a species that actually grows from airlayers. Pines, for instance, typically are difficult. I know Mughal pine is a different species, but most pines are difficult to airlayer. So using the wrong species, then it's really not up to you that it fails. It just fails because it is very difficult to grow new roots on that species. To be honest, bridging of the layering side I don't really call failure, because the top stays alive, but you do not get roots. And particularly a Trident maple is able to very quickly grow callus over the airlayering side. And that might be a ground for not getting any roots. Next to that, of course, you see it here, this pot is dripping wet. That's not good for airlayering. To get good airlayers going, to get good root formation, there needs to be a balance between air and water. Effectively, if your airlayer is completely soaked with water, it will not create any roots. At the same time, the moment that roots start forming, the plant will start taking up water. That's when you need to water the airlayer side, otherwise the roots dry out and your airlayer might fail. Interesting, I have found that even though an Arakawa gets a very corky bark, that doesn't necessarily hinder the airlayering. The roots will just come below the bark and spread out. But what does happen with maples a lot is that I find there's animals living in the substrate and they just live off the callus tissue, and that hampers the development of roots. But this is not the main reason why an airlayer fails, because the main reason an airlayer fails, I'll get to that. And of course I wanted to tell you, with all the wind now you can see what's happening to this pot, but now of course the wind drops for a second. Here this long branch has started to push against the pot, and every time it blows this pot moves against the area that I'm air layering, and therefore there's a little bit of space between the trunk and the substrate, and the substrate is constantly rubbing against the layer side. So I need to take this off and I need to reattach this pot. So I'm opening this up. You see the pot is actually falling apart. There's also some tape here. And I can take it off. And you can tell here, well actually, there is a tiny little root forming here. Now with this tiny little root that sits here and the callousing happening here on the side, I could do two things. I can put another pot around it, or I can take this off and decide I am going to use this as a separate plant. And that is in fact what I'm going to do. I am the person who likes to take off his air layers early. This is for many people way too young to remove an air layer. This I'm now going to put in my greenhouse. Knowing that it's not going to be all that sunny this week, but it is nice and warm. And I'll put it just between the tomato plants so it's nice and sheltered. Making sure not to bump it, of course. Now I know that the ones that I separated for many people are too early to separate. Now it's always difficult to imagine how many roots you can expect on a plant the next year. So this one I separated last year, and this one also I separated late last year. And now if I take them out of the pot, let's have a look what the roots have done. The pots are very wet, as said. We're not having a great summer. You can see it's a little twin trunk, but this is the sort of root ball that I now have. Nice, compact, well established. This plant is happy and healthy growing into this pot. We are in the middle of the growing season. I'm just going to push this nice root ball just back into this pot and fill it back up. Same here, this only had one root on one side. There we go. So this is the growth of one season of roots. The root ball has completely matured. No reason for taking this apart. There we go. This gets to grow, and in spring I'll do root work on it. This I can now clean up, either with a saw or with clippers, but because I just took it out of the pot, I'm going to leave it alone for another couple of weeks. Now the other two air layers were a little bit of a joke. I did know that they were doing well, but I didn't think they had rooted yet. But this one I am really concerned about, because this one I already put on last year. It didn't root. This year I recut it and I put some rooting hormone on it and I re-wrapped it. And now I still don't see any signs, even though the season has been already 3 months underway. And now I just want to see what's happening here on the inside and see whether I might need to rethink the strategy on this one. It is very wet, even though I've not been watering it, because the water can just come in and out. And let me see whether there's anything happening here in terms of roots. I have no roots. You can see here there's this whole ridge of callousing that is taking place. I'm putting a pot in here, which is a little bit better in air circulation. I'm going to recut the lowest edge, and then I'm going to coat this in rooting hormone and see whether then the next couple of months are going to give me roots. If, of course, the callus does produce roots now, it will create a nice flare. I'm cutting it flush. Also, any potential bridging that's taking place. Here in the back there is some indication that it might be bridging, but it isn't yet. And then just rushing rooting hormone. It hasn't filled unless you've given up or until the top has died. Until that point, there's still the potential for it to root. You just might need more time. Now, for good measure, also putting some of the rooting hormones a little bit higher up on the bark. But I am really hoping that the callus will issue roots. Let's see whether with adding sphagnum moss instead of substrate, I will also have better results. Don't really like the sphagnum moss. I prefer to use substrate because later upon separation that works better. But well, hey, antifungal properties and magical when air layering. So I'm just filling this pot with fresh sphagnum and see how that works. And I just like to remember this one. This is an air layer now of 2 years old, and I'm actually starting to think about the first real styling. I've made some major cuts, But besides that, I've just mostly let it grow, establishing a new root mass. But for a 2-year-old plant, this is going somewhere. This Deshojo, I separated, I think it was last year, also with only very few roots, and I planted it up, and now it is starting to become a nice established twin trunk. And next year I'll wire this out and position it properly in a pot. And this one was on last year. I did a whole range of green maple Airlayers. Also this one came off with very few roots, but you know, they all establish, and the next year they grow quite well. Good signs that your Airlayer is taking are a strong whip growing just below the layering side. That's a clear sign that sap flow is now no longer going primarily to the top, it is also going to the side branches. Another sign, of course, is the substrate that you're using for the airlayering. The substrate that you're using for the airlayering is drying out. If you see that happening, then you know there's roots in there. Third and last way that you can know that there's roots is by looking. If you use a little pot, at the bottom of the pot, you sometimes see the first roots appearing in the holes. Or if you use a plastic baggie, then along the surface of the plastic baggie, you will see roots occurring. And with that, it's a clear sign there's roots. And for me, as soon as there are roots, I can start planting up. Now on this same tree, there is 2 more Airlayers in place. And these branches here are issuing very, very strong growth. Typically for me, that's a sign that root development has started. But with this tree, I just don't know. So also here, I'm just going to take a quick peek and see what's happening. Normally, I'd already expect to see some roots pushing here. Again, the Airlayer might be staying too wet because with all the rain, these have just been continuously receiving water. Normal summers, not an issue. This summer, a very big issue. Okay, no bridging here. Actually, everything looks perfectly fine. Just needs more time by the looks of it. Just a clear situation of wait a little bit longer and you might be rewarded. I'm just going to add a little bit of rooting hormone. And let's just close it off. This is just a matter of time. Now for completeness sake, let's check this one as well. It's the last Airlayer I've got still a Trident. The semi-last Airlayer I've got going. And then I'll check the Trident as well. And as said, for the first week of July, this is quite late in my experience to not have roots on most of these. But spring has been cold, it has been slow, it has been wet. And this checking, of course, is just me giving into curiosity, right? You can also decide, no, I'm just waiting until the end of the season to see what's there. Here, again, nothing wrong with the layer side. I don't see any bridging, but also no roots. Same thing as the previous, I'll add a bit of rooting hormone and be done with it. Well, the weather is typical for the weather we've been having all summer long. It's just been cold, wet, windy, rainy, and particularly for Trident, I don't expect any roots in here. Now Tridents I find notoriously bad at air layering, and that's why I have this little wire here below it, because they tend to really callus over quickly, and I need to remove here even the callus that's growing underneath it. This is a first indicator that a root might be on its way. So I'm now just going to quickly scar these edges, remove everything that's growing underneath the wire. Then I'm going to put a little bit of sphagnum around it and wrap it up again. And in 4 to 6 weeks, I really hope that there's a pleasant surprise for me. But the main message today is, if you have an Airlayer and in midsummer it has not rooted, it has not filled. It has only filled the moment you give up or when the top has died. And until then you can just re-wrap it. If you want, add a little bit of rooting hormone, scar the callus tissue that is there, make sure there's no bridging of the area that you removed the bark off, and then just wait for another couple of weeks. And in 4 weeks, check again. Now to be honest, all these reasons, they're fine. If you control all of those, pretty much every single time you should get roots. Now if your plant is not healthy, it's not growing well, all those sort of reasons, they hamper the development of Airlayer roots. And yeah, your plant needs to be healthy. They need to actively be growing and extending and have lots and lots of foliage mass. But if you keep that in mind, then it will grow roots. Now the main reason why it fails is impatience. You might decide that you open it up, you look at it and you see there's no roots, and then you decide to quit. Or you open it up and you break young roots. That is the main reason why air layers fail. You're impatient. If you're not sure how to take air layers, take a look at this video. Or if you have a successful air layer and it has roots, you don't know how to pot it up and to take care of it afterwards, take a look at this video. And I guess that brings us to the end. See you next time.